Hello. Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you can hear me. Welcome to the Exertis Education Spotlight webinar. Let me introduce myself first. So I'm Ian Aitken. I'm the director of our AV business. So a very warm welcome to you on this Tuesday. I've got the days right. Tuesday afternoon. So first, a bit of housekeeping, if I may. Obviously, you guys are all on mute to stop yourselves sort of shouting abuse at me. However, if you do want to add questions into the chat, on the right-hand side, you'll see questions in the chat. We will have time for a Q&A at the end of this. Probably leaving about sort of 5 or 10 minutes, or depending how many questions are in there. So. Yeah, that's really the very basic bit of housekeeping. I think it's probably important to introduce you all to the panel. We've got a really great panel here today, and hopefully we'll have a really lively debate. We've been catching up between ourselves, rehearsing a few questions and having some questions and queries amongst ourselves, and there's been some really healthy debate. So we've got a great panel for you, and I'm sure there'll be some really interesting things to come out of today. So without further ado, let me introduce you to the panel. They can all introduce themselves. So I don't know, Delia, if you want to go first.
Sure. Hi. Thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm Delia DeCourcy. I'm a global solutions manager on the worldwide education team at Lenovo. And so in addition to being a device provider, we provide complex solutions to our education customers across the entire globe. Good to be here. I'm a former educator, so 25 years in education at the K-12 and higher education levels until about 1.5 years ago. Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. John, I don't know if you want to go first, John Moore, just going sort of round the screen as I see it, if that's all right.
Hi, welcome. My name's John Moore. I've been at Smart now for about the last 5 years. Just like Delia, former teacher, Key Stage 1 trained, move up to Key Stage 2, undertook a research project on interactive, on a smart board actually. That was published and then fell into the AV industry. So I'm an engagement manager at Smart, work with multi-academy trusts, ensuring that technology is used, and implementation strategy, working with initial teacher training institutions, and have trained hundreds, if not thousands, of teachers during the last sort of last half year, I suppose, really.
Thanks, John. And Chris, if I can, you're putting us all to shame with that wonderful lounge of yours, in comparison to my pokey little cupboard where I find myself in. So, Chris, over to you.
That's funny. Thanks, Ian. I'm Chris Janes. Thanks for everybody for joining. This is going to be a lot of fun. We did a little bit of a round table beforehand, and I could tell this is going to be a really interesting exercise for sure. Hopefully it is for everybody. My background is computer science. I founded a company called Immersive Technologies. Out of my academic research, I was a professor for a number of years. And the whole idea of the company really was to introduce a set of software technologies that would increase student engagement. And we started with the problem of the video cable, because that became a presentation by default, sort of tiered classroom only sort of supportive technology. We've been looking at how that allows you to sort of engage students, allow them to share content, and really, like, become more effective in the classroom. So that's what we do, and hopefully we get to weave some of that into the discussion today.
Thanks. Thanks.
Shall I jump in straight away, Ian?
Go for it, Jonathan.
Yeah, I found out where I am on the screen, so I knew I was next. So that's great. So it's learning on the fly. So yeah, Jonathan Clark, product and solution marketing for EMEA from Poly. Started my career in video, which was going to be the year of video 2015, as a briefing center manager in our London briefing center. So it's getting to use that technology, whether that's video, audio, headsets that we've added now as we joined with Plantronics, enhancing that education experience. And it's a pleasure to be here today to talk to you about some of our solutions and our services that can help as we're driving this new way of remote education.
Brilliant, Jonathan. Thank you. Matuza, over to you, sir.
Yep, very natural for me to go after Jonathan, because Jonathan's from Poly and I'm his colleague as well. At Poly, I'm the strategic alliances lead, managing the Microsoft relationship. I can see on my shirt here. And my job is to ensure that our teams, our go-to-market teams, are well aligned with Microsoft teams. And as you can see, we've got like a massive adoption of Microsoft Teams in education sector right now. And what we do at Poly is make sure that the experience, the end user experience in using Teams is the best. And that's the reason we are here on the panel speaking about both Microsoft and Poly solutions that go into education.
Great, Matuza. Thank you very much indeed. And last but by no means least, Paul.
Good afternoon, everybody. Firstly, apologies, you might be able to see my voice is just about to give up, probably something to do with half term. My name is Paul Edge. I'm deputy head at Ribblesdale High School. That's my day job. As part of that, I'm also the tech demonstrator lead for the DFE project as well at Ribblesdale. And I worked very closely over a number of years with Microsoft around using their products in education, so Office 365 and all the apps associated with that. So I'm really looking forward to sharing our experiences this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Paul, we will make sure we ask you short and sweet questions, my friend there, so that voice doesn't give up. All right, well, thank you, everyone. And yeah, thank you very much indeed for joining the panel here. So, just setting the scene a little bit, I suppose. 23rd of March, 2020, a day that I certainly invested in my mind and my memory. That's the first lockdown, and who would have thought? Who would have thought in your wildest, I say dreams, probably nightmares, really, that almost a year on, we'll still be in lockdown now, lockdown 3. But there's hope out there. There's no doubt. I hope our friend Mr. Johnson will give us some sensible news next week in terms of how we plan to release ourselves out of this pandemic. And but it's here, and it's introduced uncertainty. This pandemic has introduced massive uncertainty into major aspects of our sort of national, global society, and including our schools. And I think it's affected everybody. People, all of the panelists here and people, out in the attendees field at the moment, how challenging it's been a year for particularly our children and our educators. But what has been very interesting is the role and the increasing role that technology is playing in how we teach, and how we learn, really. And hopefully we can harness some positives from what's been, from the negatives that's been this year, and hopefully we can improve the way, we help our children learn for the better. And I think part of what we want to do today is really talk about the future, talk about the technology, and debate perhaps how COVID has impacted the way we learn, the way we are learning right now, and the way we will learn for the future, and also a little bit about what the future holds. So that's kind of the theme, really, for today's debate. And I will sorry, my questions are sort of listed here so I don't forget them, so pardon me as I turn slightly to one side. But the first question that I've got here really is of course about the pandemic and the events of FY20 and how it's affected your establishment, how it's affected your business. And I think I'd like to start with Paul, if I may, because obviously you're at the coalface, you're a teacher, you're an educator right now, and it'd be interesting to sort of hear from you about really how directly COVID has impacted your year.
Yeah, I think there's been a massive impact, and it's well publicised throughout, the press and nationally and internationally as well. I think the big challenge for us in those initial stages was how do we react to the situation? How do we carry on and have that continuity of learning whilst working remotely? And I think it's not only the education side that's changed, it's also the way that our staff interact as well, because obviously them working remotely, schools traditionally are very sort of physically based establishments where you speak to people on a daily basis, and I think that's been a massive impact about how we collaborate as well. And I think the big benefit we sort of had against a lot of schools was that ability to react rapidly. So throughout these times of when we've gone in and out of lockdown, it's allowed us to react to whatever the situation throws at us, and that agility is key, really. And I think that's something that all schools and colleges and universities need to consider moving forward, is that we might need that agility again in the future, and therefore how does that support our business, in our case the core business of teaching and learning.
Yeah, very interesting points there. John, what's your view really on that? How's that affected your business from Smart's perspective?
Yeah, I think really all of us at Smart, a lot of us are former teachers, and the main drive was really initially was how we could help and support teachers and parents and pupils pretty much immediately as we went into sort of first lockdown. We provided complimentary access just like others really, to our distance learning software, Smart Learning Suite Online, through to the summer. And we created a dedicated distance learning site with training and how-to guides and resources, really just trying to help teachers. We were online providing sort of bite-sized training and resources. So it wasn't just teachers, it was parents as well, because we all found ourselves in lockdown with children at home, didn't we? And I think our roadmap was pretty much on the way to creating a flexible classroom. We weren't 100% there. So our product team sort of pretty much overnight pivoted the order of our sort of development and our roadmap, and ultimately listened to our educators and our community to see what they wanted. So over the course of the sort of pandemic, we've added things such as digital manipulatives, instructional audio, integrated with Teams, Microsoft Teams and G Drive. And only last week we've just launched a whole revised sort of tools within Smart Learning Suite Online. But ultimately it was how we could help. As I said, I've worked with initial teacher training institutions to ensure that their teachers, our future teachers, that they could still continue their training and provide help to schools as well. So ultimately it was one of help and how we could make learning more engaging as well for teachers, but with ease, I think is the main thing. We appreciated what they were going through.
Excellent. I mean, opening it up to the rest of the panel. Anybody else sort of have some views on the?
I can chip in. I think from a Poly perspective, we were always about remote learning, remote working with video and headsets. And I think in terms of secondary education and universities, they'd made that investment in some of the technology and the cameras, and they were using that and recording a lot of their coursework. I think unless you're at Paul's school, I think there's a lot of, and again, it's a different schools have got different levels of expertise, and obviously Paul's mentioned that they've got the infrastructure and ready to go and could cut over from an in-person schooling to a more remote schooling. I think from our perspective, again, like John was saying, it's all about supporting and how we can help people drive that remote education experience. Obviously, it's the content, the manipulation that the other guys provide. It's all about making sure that you're clearly heard and being allowed students to focus. So our development, we've been developing room systems. Obviously, we're pivoting as well in terms of providing personal use devices, whether that's for the remote educator or for the remote student, or providing those headsets. So it's all about improving that experience so that you can have that engagement, you can have some sort of immersive experience. You're never going to replace that in-person teaching, but if you can complement that and provide the best of breed for your video experience and your audio experience, and that will allow your students to focus and also carry on that education experience.
Yeah, good point.
No, that's interesting. I'm going to jump in on that because I'm seeing a pattern that I've actually I think I'm hearing everybody say that they've accelerated stuff that was already underway in their companies, and that's a theory I've always had. When the pandemic hit, you can almost view it as a time machine that we got into and had needs that suddenly emerged 5 years into the future, because I don't think anything dramatically changed. It's just everything had to accelerate, right? This idea of personal device use, like Jonathan, you just mentioned, that was already here, right? People already wanted to use their own device to control room systems or to be able to share content to a screen when they walk up to it. It just accelerated dramatically. We started hearing suddenly, hey, it's touchless now. I need touchless solutions versus I want a better user experience on the device. Same underlying technology, I think. So for us, it was about how do we accelerate stuff that we already had in flight. In about March timeframe, I brought a bunch of universities together to do a workshop on what's going to happen and how do we need to change our roadmap. And really what we did is we learned 3 things. We had to accelerate our Solstice conference solution, which is a wireless, touchless video conferencing system. And I've even had people say to me, wow, how did you know you needed to do a BYOD touchless conferencing solution that you launched in the middle of 2020? Literally, it's like it started 2 years ago. It just had to get accelerated, that's all, because we already knew that's the best way to interact with your codec. You want to walk into a room and open your laptop, start a call, make a Teams call, make a Zoom call, close the lid, walk out, and you're done, right? So there was that. We launched a project called the Wellness Initiative, which is really focused on some really interesting, I'll call them compelling new problems that did emerge, like the inability to schedule rooms in the hybrid campus era, right? Like students aren't going to be able to say, I'm going to reserve that every Monday morning for 10, for an hour for 10 people, because people have the freedom to come and go. You don't know. So we're building a wayfinding app that will launch in April. That was part of that wellness initiative. And then we accelerated and launched active learning. And on top of that, we built an auto provisioning system. So when you get pods and you put them in your classrooms, they auto provision, so you don't even have to send someone to campus to do it. So all that stuff, we launched really 3 products in 2020. And for me, I think there's a social responsibility component as an inventor, as a software guy, as a technologist, that you have to look at society and say, what's the needs that I'm trying to answer all the time? And I think you just change your roadmap to respond to those needs as they emerge. And 2020 was, the Super Bowl of that, right? It was all of that all the time. So it's a really interesting year.
Oh, you had to mention the Super Bowl. I follow the Bills, you see, so someone's got to rub salt in the wound somewhere, haven't they?
I would say, so from a device perspective, because that's something that Lenovo is, of course, primarily concerned with and meeting the needs of our customers. And Chris, you're talking about sort of how you've had to accelerate some of your products. We've seen a massive explosion, of course, in the need for student devices and teacher devices. And so I think on the customer side, schools are still, I think, trying to catch up to the situation that they find themselves in. I think Paul's school is at one end of the continuum, and you've got schools that are at the far other end where they're just getting devices maybe for the first time. And so at Lenovo, we have been working really hard to meet that demand. And fortunately, we've been able to do that. But in conjunction with that, what we've seen is a massive increase in the adoption of 2 particular softwares. One is a partner, Absolute, and that is part of our firmware, and that provides device security, endpoint security, and some mobile device management. And then also our Land School Air product, which allows for remote classroom management so that teachers can see what's going on student screens when students are at home. It works really well in the classroom as well. But when students are using something like Teams, which I think the adoption of Teams has been tremendous and has been such a great platform for collaboration and learning management. Teachers can see, are students actually doing what they need to be doing, or are they on YouTube, or are they playing Minecraft, or something else with a classroom management solution. So those are sort of some of the basic needs that we've seen, and massive adoption. Of course, there's all kinds of other needs around student safety and digital curriculum, digital tools. And in terms of what we've had to rapidly develop in response is our hybrid classroom solution, because as all of you have already pointed out, there's just a really tremendous need for that. And I don't think that's going to go away once the pandemic has subsided, because we've seen an acceleration of learning models and innovation in learning models. And so that puts us in a really different place.
Yeah, interesting. And I'm not on that point, actually, if I can just sort of move on, maybe back to Paul briefly, and Matthews, of course, will give you some time to come in this in just a second. But just picking up on that, I said at the start there's hopefully an announcement in the UK, and I'm not sure what's happening over the pond there in terms of schools going back and being released, etc. But I'm hearing in my non-educated eye, and Paul, you may know a lot more than I am about, will schools go back on in England, pardon me, being more specific, on the 8th of March? And if that happens, it's likely to be gradual, I believe. And I guess the question is, what do we think learning's going to be like as we come back? Is there going to be this rush to everyone's going to be back on-prem? Is there going to need to be this balance between remote on-prem learning? What's the sort of view of Paul and the rest of the panel on that? What does the balance of the future look like?
I think someone mentioned this, that you can't substitute that face-to-face delivery, so that obviously provides a prime element. However, I think it's got a lot of educators thinking now about how we deliver in terms of education. The model we use is very Victorian in its design and has been around for 100+ years. And this, this pandemic, if you want to take the positive out of it, is given that step change in terms of EdTech use. And I think we've got to look at where we are now, and schools are at all different points, but I think they need to reflect on what bits are going to work for them in their setting, because what works for us at Ribblesdale may not work for other people. And I think it's also about harnessing the power of technology. So it's using, you know, I think most people in the call so far have touched on this. It's using the technology that's there for the benefit of the learners. So whether that's accessibility needs and using things like learning tools in 365 or other aspects. And I think we're going to get to a position where we've got this blend of traditional versus new. And I think it's key that we make sure we get that blend right, depending on where our learners are. But I think that the key thing for me now, really sitting on both sides of the fence, sort of on the EdTech and on the educator side, is that how do we make it stick? What is it going to do now to make it stick? And I think we're starting to hear noises around from the DFE in our case and from like exam boards about how they're thinking internally about shifting things. And I think that's really important. And just before I finish on this bit, I think the key thing is to work with the partners. That's where we've got where we are now, is working with the partners and getting them to support. We're not experts in EdTech. We probably are to a certain extent now, but you've got to draw on that knowledge to get the plan, the transformation plan that you want in place.
Yeah, really interesting. Thank you. Again, opening that same question up in terms of the, you know, what we think that the balance is going to be, and in the future, and certainly in the very near future, of course.
Paul, when you I have a quick question for you, Paul, a little follow-up. When you mentioned the transition plan, that must also cover pedagogy and lecture design as well, and outside the technology, right? Because I'm noticing there's a big, you know, a gray area between our ability now. I think technology has almost leapfrogged what's going on in education, and that now it's time to ask, hey, what can I do with all these new things that, you know, that literally over the last 10 years that emerged, right? When wireless became real and all that.
I think, you know, as educators, it's a bit like a kid in a sweet shop now. It's what do you draw on? What bits are going to enhance the curriculum delivery? And I think EdTech has been seen as a bolt-on to the normal core business of teaching and learning. That shouldn't be the case. It should be an integral part of that decision-making process around school improvement. Absolutely. So I think pulling partners in to help with that discussion is probably where I'm coming from on that one, Chris.
Yeah, it's funny because we have a project up in Chicago with a school district, and I won't go into too much detail, but the ability to take wireless conferencing, and then also our active learning solution that lets you throw, you know, a faculty member can take an iPad and literally go, I want that screen to show up on all the student tables, go, right? Like just gesture on a pad or pulse it, and there's no new hardware. It's just all software on the existing network. We're deploying that in conjunction with wireless conferencing so that remote learners can see all that happening on all the screens dynamically. The question is, like, for me, it's like, okay, that's great. It used to cost you, can you imagine doing that with a traditional AV hardware? That would be a $500,000 investment with all kinds of video switching. And then now you're putting a room system on top of video switching, and now you got to control that. Faculty would never do that. But now you can just play. You can try that easily, right? Just download software and deploy it and try it out. The question now is, how do you put those remote learners on equal footing? How do you do lecture design so that you're bringing them in at appropriate times, or that they're engaged instead of just the local users? Or, you know, you have to rethink some of those things. I think that's where a lot of the compelling challenges come into play. And people like me necessarily won't do that. I'm focused on the technology development, but there's plenty of people in the academic community looking at new models completely. I think they'll all emerge in the next 2 to 3 years. It'll be really exciting.
I think what's been striking to me in talking with educators, both at the K-12 level and then also professors at university, is, you know, there has been this massive influx of technology and software into teaching and learning spaces, but really it's about what's changed for teachers in their practices and professors. And so what I've heard fairly consistently is that they have discovered things that work better for their learners, whether it's in a remote fashion or they can imagine adapting similar practices for when they go back to class. For example, on a very basic level at university, lectures. So I've talked to multiple professors in the US who are like, oh, I'm never going to do a long lecture again in class. There's absolutely no reason for me to do that. I can do a lot of active learning with my students and have them watch the lecture. You know, it's basic flipped learning, but that's just not something that they had explored previously because they hadn't had to. So, you know, necessity is maybe not the mother of invention here, but the mother of adoption. So I think it's important to think about on a very individual basis. What are the new practices that have been adopted? And I'd be curious to hear from Paul what he's seen in his school. I mean, you are already technologically advanced, so I'm curious how your teachers are thinking differently about what they're going to do moving forward.
I think you've sort of hit the nail on the head there with those aspects. I think we're all looking at how, you know, the learners now, the young people are learning. And if you ask how my sort of 13 and 10-year-old learn, they learn using digital technology. You know, I can't drive Minecraft, I can to a certain extent, but they certainly can. So it's about how we embrace their skills around their digital skills to actually enhance the learning. And I think, you know, the sort of the live delivery versus pre-recorded or something like that. The pre-recorded has certainly shown a lot of our young people at Ribblesdale to be able to excel if they are in charge of their own pace of learning, and that's flipping the learning to a certain extent, isn't it? And I think that way then your teachers are a very expensive resource, aren't they? So therefore you can then deploy your teachers to have that real focus on maybe intervention groups. I think underlying this in a lot of schools, the challenge still is that digital divide. And I think, Delia, you touched on this a few minutes ago, is how do we get everyone on that level playing field? And before we go near some of the things we're discussing today, it's about that infrastructure readiness. And I think, you know, there's got to be a lot of frank conversations, particularly at our level at secondary, about investment in that technology infrastructure level to enable the things that Chris is talking about, Delia, and everyone around the table this afternoon to embrace that the benefits that are there.
Just on that point, I think that's a really good point. Sorry, just while I remember, we've got a mixture of resellers on the call, we've got a mixture of some end users on the call, etc. Just on that infrastructure point, because it is critical. I mean, we're talking about, and all you guys are in with some wonderful technologies which will really help learning. You know, it could really help hopefully catch up some of the learning that may have been lost, and we'll come on to that point in a moment as well. But in terms of that infrastructure, and again, just some advice if I can ask you, what are some of the key considerations infrastructure-wise that do need to be taken into account by our resellers and by our end users to sort of, you know, being able to make the most or get the most out of the technology that everybody on the school has to offer? Again, throwing that out to the panel. I mean, is it? I mean, networking is perhaps something that's considered. I mean, has anybody come up against these sort of these challenges when you know, putting technological products into education establishments?
I think you need a flexible solution really to encompass everything that we've been touching on. So with regard to the software that Smart Learning Suite provides, it could be synchronous, it can be asynchronous. Access has been, we've already raised, as Delia was saying, that access has been an issue. So as long as we're flexible, as long as we've been flexible throughout this, then we can meet the needs of the educators. Paul was really going to come on to a point that you mentioned earlier with regard to learning. Has there been a lot of teaching, would you agree, but also not so much quality learning? So does this give us the opportunity of looking and taking stock of the positives of where we've come and what we've the positives there, and actually our remotely ready survey sort of educators were far more upbeat about the effectiveness of teachers teaching as opposed to students learning. And as that affected by access, is that affected by their skill set? So we've talked about CPD, a requirement for teachers coming out of this for CPD. So there's been some great benefits and people have coped exceptionally well, but isn't this a time now to take stock and look at access, look at devices, and actually take what we've got as, or what schools have got of multi-academy trusts or individual schools of where they're at, and then look at their vision and then develop the curriculum and strategies and programs around this to take all of the positives and benefits. So we have an EdTech assessment tool at Smart, which works really effectively on sort of 5 areas really, and can help multi-academy trusts and schools and more importantly, working with resellers of once you've got that vision, you then know where you're going to want to go. But I think my concern is that whilst there's been some teaching online, there's been a lot teachers have responded superbly, but ultimately how much learning has been taking place, and how do we catch up? Paul, perhaps you've got some comments on that.
Yeah, I think there's a few things to sort of pull out from there. The first one is about whether your students are digitally aware or digitally competent, and that takes a lot longer. And you know, to move from that awareness to competence around using technology to its best ability. And in our journey, that's taken a few years to do it. I think there's an opportunity now, same as Chris mentioned in business, in terms of grasping that now and moving it on faster. I think that is here. I think secondly, you need that overall digital transformation strategy alongside school improvement strategy. So where do you want to be in the next 3 to 5 years time, and how are you going to get there? Because without that plan and everyone bought into that, then it's not going to work. And that's generally what's happened in education around EdTech over the past 10 years probably, is that people embrace newfangled technology, you know, things that, you know, interactive whiteboards, for example, potentially is one of the big areas that, you know, was a big thing sort of 15, maybe 20 years ago, but didn't really impact on the learning. And I think what you've got to do is once you've got the digital platforms in place, I think where a lot of schools have fallen down, particularly during remote learning, is they've not been able to assess where their learners are at. And that's the way to do that is to have a device in your hand, is to have the platforms that you're all describing to allow you as an educator to know exactly where your class are at and where they need to go. And I think, you know, the schools that have struggled with that have been the ones that have tried to do teaching for an hour online, you know, delivery in the traditional method. This isn't traditional delivery in terms of education, and it's got to be new, and the blend of the two has got to be there. But when you've got in things like low stakes, high frequency testing, that AFL coming back, then you can start as an educator to inform decisions around curriculum delivery. And I think that's where a lot of schools and colleges are missing at the moment, that gap, and that's where they're going to play catch up. Once you get there, that can then have as much, if not more, of an impact on teacher workload and around education in a more physical environment of a traditional school.
Yeah, and I think it's a good point in terms of, yeah, in terms of the envisioning. It's obviously the Malthus as a hierarchy of needs is, you know, what's your base level, you know, from a networking, wireless connectivity, you know, and then you layer on the capabilities on there. And obviously as a beacon of you know, from an EdTech influencer, I guess, Paul, you know, they've got these beacons of schools that you can use your learning. And I guess that's where you can leverage some of the technology from a video and audio conferencing perspective, that you might use the technology, you know, for that remote education, that remote learning experience. But obviously, if you invested that technology, you can also use it for sharing, you know, subject matter experts in the field of a specific type of education as you're moving forward. So you're not just using it for today, you're just using it to develop, using those schools of specialization where they've got that experience and that knowledge and that investment already today. You can share your learning experiences, and I've joined quite a lot of the videos from the DFE where they've talked about that, you know, the sharing of that information from the experts in the field, that, you know, from the likes of your school, Paul, which is really positive.
I agree with you, Jonathan. I think it's going to be really useful to allow schools to provide a broader curriculum now, perhaps to subjects that perhaps they might not been able to have sort of facilitated with the small numbers involved. So schools and groups and multi-academy trusts can run courses that perhaps with solutions such as Poly and things like that, and that they haven't been able to provide in the past. Is that something that you're looking to do, Paul?
Yeah, I think that there is always that balance between cost of curriculum delivery and resource availability. And I think it does open up opportunities in terms of how you deliver some of the course content where there's less demand within a school. And that's particularly if you're a smaller school that you can deliver between maybe several schools. You know, they all hire one specialist in that curriculum area to do remote delivery. So I think that's where there's a lot of opportunity to be sought. You know, traditional initially those types of courses, you would look at busing kids to a certain place, maybe a local FE college, to allow that delivery to happen. And so I think with the availability now of EdTech and the new, the acceptance that it actually works, and let's face it, this has been a massive social experiment as far as education is concerned. People doing PhDs would have given the left arm to do this, but I think what's happened is now it's opened people's eyes and said, yeah, absolutely, people haven't fallen flat on the face. Learners are still learnt. Teachers have still been able to deliver, and curriculum development has carried on. So let's now move forward with what we've got.
I think I want to circle back to this question of infrastructure that Ian initially brought up, because I started to think about, well, yes, infrastructure, we've been dealing with the device fleet and the need for more Wi-Fi access for students and hotspots and all that. But I think a lot of what we're ending up talking about here is the infrastructure of teaching and learning, right? So robust digital curriculum and tools. And Jonathan kind of pointed to that initially, like, well, what are our students actually learning? So we're providing all these devices, but and some of the teaching is great, but what are students actually learning? And that kind of got me thinking about the need for learning analytics when it comes to teaching and learning infrastructure, right? So that we can really get at more personalized learning. And I think that's where the future is, because really it is all about what are our students actually learning. The tech isn't the thing. The tech is the thing that gets us to the thing, right?
Absolutely.
And I agree with you. I think if they're engaged, if the students are engaged and they're given a voice within the curriculum, and then they are engaged in their own learning, and then different learning styles can take place. As you mentioned, flipped learning, and actually all of the things that we've perhaps been talking about for years, with regard to our software and technology that it could attain to. Now I think that opens that out as real possibilities. Sorry, I interrupted.
But
no
please.
problem, a very similar point to what Della and Jonathan have been mentioning. So in fact, in education, there are a lot more possibilities have opened up than they were before. For example, now you can practically have borderless education. Doesn't matter if I'm in the same catchment area or I'm across the pond or I'm I don't know, a million miles away. I can still attend the same classroom. Now I think what's going to really matter is how we are going to take this technology and make sure we are able to give access to some of the students that never got access, probably because of disabilities, maybe because of language barriers, maybe because of geographic barriers, and how we blend in that in-classroom learning with the learning that people can have remotely, and a mix of both. So for example, I went to the class this morning, I attended the lecture, but I probably am somebody who needs to sort of go through it twice to be able to understand. So I go back home, I slow it down, and I go through it again. And that's when technology, like the technology that helps people to be heard clearly, to be seen clearly, will matter a lot. And the other thing is things like captioning in Teams allow people to be able to sort of get the knowledge even if they can't hear. And things like language translation in Teams help people to understand even if they don't understand the language. I think there are plenty of positives to it. It's just about how we use the technology to make that happen.
No, that's a really good point.
Your point about accessibility is, like, for me, I'm starting to realize it's related to the question about infrastructure, because, it's like if you're, I think as a community, if you're a reseller, an integrator, or a consultant in educational technologies, or a vendor like me building technologies, you have to think about how does that technology, what's the requirements for the infrastructure, and what does it mean about how accessible that technology will be, right? So it would be easy for me, for example, to introduce a wireless streaming algorithm that requires an i7 8-core laptop, but there's only a few elite institutions that are now going to have access to that technology or that user experience, right? So you got to dig down into the technology stack and build something that will work on a Chromebook or a phone that comes to the classroom that's maybe 8 years old, because a lot of students have that. They're not on the latest technology. So you got to be able to embrace those. I think the other piece is the user experience has to be simple and egalitarian and easy for students that either are very sophisticated or are not, right? So it's somehow you have to design solutions all the way up. And that doesn't just mean people like me developing software. It means also how are you wiring up the room? What are you thinking about the user experience for the students and the teacher in that space? So that the infrastructure doesn't have to suddenly be, let's change all our switches out for, 4 times the cross-section bandwidth so that we can have a cool wireless solution. Not good, right? Now you're at the top business schools in the world and nowhere else, and no one else gets the benefit. So I think that's super key. And I want to respond quick to Delia's comment about analytics, because 100% agree. I've like for a year, obviously my background's AI, so I'm a big analytics guy. We have been building this Solstice Cloud solution for years, and it all started actually I mentioned business schools. Now it's going to sound like we're real elitist, but I work with Dave Seidel at Wharton Business School, UPenn. And he said to me one day, gee, you guys are on all the student laptops, all the infrastructure. Can't you give us a better picture than, hey, that box is on, that box is off, right? So we've been building this thing that allows you to know, did Google Docs get shared? How long? Did that student rate that class well, or was it engaging? Did they feel disengaged? And we're even starting to feed that back into real time, back to the lecturer themselves. So you can get a real-time dial. I would have loved this when I taught. I kind of pride myself on I could read people's faces, but I would love to have seen an analytics score as you're lecturing, right? Are people falling behind? Are they back on the other slide that you presented 2 minutes ago because they're confused by those equations? Return, right? Go back and re-engage the students or whatever. I just think those are all kinds of awesome answers for if we're gonna understand what happens in the hybrid workplace, we have to understand the analytics behind it, almost in real time, so we can design spaces appropriately.
No, fascinating. And would you believe, I'm just looking glancing at my own sort of analytics area here, which is the clock on the right-hand side of my computer. It tells me already.
I'm on that slide as well, so we're all right.
We've been going for 45 minutes, but look, there's one sort of last point I'd just like to raise, and I hope the attendees are okay with that, just for the final sort of to wrap up, because what I've become really enthused about actually by talking to you all, listening to you all over the last sort of last week, etc., and particularly and Paul at the front edge from a school perspective, but also you guys as technology leaders, is there's a great amount of opportunity, I think, and it's a lot of positives that I can feel coming across. It's been a year of real hardship, I think, but I'm picking up and I'm feeling that there is a lot of things that we can use COVID as the catalyst. We can use it as the accelerator. We can use it for something to really build a foundation of positivity for learning as we move forward. And I just think I'd like to perhaps give everyone just a couple of sentences of a way that we've got resellers on the call, we've got end users on the call. What are the opportunities that lie in front of them? From a reseller's perspective or an end user perspective, what are those opportunities? What do they look like for the next year? I'll throw that out to anyone that would like to answer.
Well, I'll jump in then if not everybody's quiet. Yeah. So from a poly perspective, obviously, video cameras enhancing that education experience. If you can make it as seamless, I know we've talked about your students enjoying that lesson and being engaged. It's trying to make that and spice it up a little bit. So if you can have a camera that tracks, makes it feel immersive, the teacher doesn't have to get involved in anything. They just join a Teams meeting or a Teams lesson that's been scheduled, and the camera will take care of the settings, and they're free to move around. And having a camera that's basically front and center, that's you probably place on the front row of your seat. So if you've got students and school kids that don't necessarily normally want to sit on the front row of the school, they normally go to the back of the class. This one gives them that prime seating, because you're treating that camera device that follows you and tracks you as your A-level, your A+ student that sits at the front row and is always first with a hand up to ask the questions and confident. And those that are less confident, and I think that's what we've seen from the tech, is that I think Paul mentioned that they've seen a tremendous growth of those that don't necessarily enjoy school as much today. They've got some sort of challenges with this types of hybrid learning. It's obviously they've seen those types of students thrive. So, blended learning's here to stay. Add video capability wherever you can. Headsets, obviously, for those that get distracted easily. There's nothing simpler than sticking a headset on with some noise cancelling, so you don't hear anything in your background. You look at a screen, and a lot of kids that are easily distracted, this is certainly something that gives them that focus. So if they were working remotely or even in the same school but in a different classroom, because for whatever reason they need to be separated, have got an opportunity to still participate in that learning experience in a way that works for how they want to learn, and not necessarily how everybody else learns and is confident there. So great opportunities from that tech perspective to add video headsets, cameras, and all sorts of stuff. So that's my bit, I think.
That's cool, Jonathan. I'll second your comment on cameras. It's going to be, in fact, my next podcast is on the emergence of the camera. This is the great era of cameras, and part of it is because the wireless stuff is here now. You don't even need a wire to access cameras like it used to be. You needed a HDMI to get to the screen. That's so true. So I would encourage anyone on the call that's looking at designing or building or deploying these kind of educational spaces to think about the challenge that we're about to see in the next year is no longer bringing the remote users or the remote students and the learners into the room. It's more about how can I get the learning experience in the room to those remote learners? How can proprioceptive stuff happen? How can kinesthetic learning happen to someone remote? How can they feel like they're in the space? I think one answer to that really is more screens and more cameras in the space itself, so that there's media everywhere and it can be seen by remote users. Faculty members can, because it's wireless access to the camera now, can choose different camera views, right? So that they can see their students, their colleagues, their friends from different angles, from different spots in the room, based on where the lecture takes you. I think it's going to be cool. I'm very positive about it. It's historical precedent. I mean, all the greatest inventions come out of times of great crisis, right? I mean, historically, this is it. We're in it right now, and we all happen to be working in that community that matters the most for it. So I think it's great. We should have a positive outlook.
Exactly.
It is a great, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No. Sorry, you go ahead, Delia, then I'll go after.
I was just going to concur. It's a great time to be working in tech. That, you know, the silver lining in this horror. But I would also agree that we're seeing a real uptake of our hybrid classroom solution, which does take that in classroom experience and bring it to the remote learner. But just to give a little bit of a preview to what Lenovo has on the horizon, we had already been working on a VR classroom solution, and that's in the marketplace, and esports, which we're seeing a huge explosion of, because that can be played remotely or, you know, in an on-campus stadium. But we are also working on AI solutions and more personalized learning, as well as professional development. So that's a little bit of a preview of what is to come from Lenovo. So there you go. Over to the next person.
Hi, Ian. I think ultimately it needs to be flexible, as we've touched on. We don't know what the future holds. It all looks positive and rosy at the moment, but ultimately flexibility is key, whether it's hybrid learning. The smart solution, the classroom is totally flexible. We can work at the front of the classroom. We can get children to collaborate. Smart Learning Suite Online is the glue, essentially, that is the software that brings the hardware and the devices together, whether they be in the classroom or remotely. It's as I said, we've integrated new solutions within Smart Learning Suite Online, not only just last week, but more importantly, they're focusing on saving teachers time, reducing workload, providing more informative feedback, making use of existing resources, but making them more engagement. Why has there been lots of teaching and perhaps not as much as student engagement? Because it needs to be exciting. It needs to be active learning, as Chris was saying. So I think we're in a great place now to be able to provide support to your resellers, our resellers, to provide solutions to schools. But ultimately, I think we'd take stock of where schools and multi-academy trusts are, what their vision is, and how we can make it personalized to fit their workflows, solutions around them, and provide the ultimate solution to enhance outcomes. So we've got the EdTech capability tool, I think I've mentioned, and that's really useful to take stock of where we are, but lots of new solutions which I keep tweeting and placing on LinkedIn of how we've enhanced Smart Learning Suite Online. So watch this space. I think the future is bright for all, and we're really here to help.
Thank you. Matuza, let's finish with the. No, thanks, Jonathan. Matuza, over to you. You had a point there. Let's finish with yourself, if we may.
Oh, that's amazing. Because my point is almost encompassing everything. Because we mentioned about the technology, what sort of opportunities are for resellers and vendors like us to do. So obviously technology is there, but there's also like a services layer that is required. Even things like workplace design or designing a classroom, because they need to be different from what they were before. If you are putting in a camera as opposed to just a lecturer augmented by a camera, then you need to sort of design differently. So we've got all of those services apart from team services, deployment or whatever. So this is the point I wanted to make.
Fantastic. Well, we're almost 10 minutes over. We could go on and on. I mean, I've got probably another half a dozen questions here, so it just proves 45 minutes flies by, doesn't it? But yeah, we've run out of time. I'd like to thank you all for your input. Thank you so much. It is genuinely fascinating, and it would be remiss of me not to mention that we've got a fantastic lineup of vendors there. Paul, from a school's perspective, has given us an insight there. The technology is all available from Exertis. Of course it is. It would be remiss of me not to mention that. And actually, if you look at all the technology that we have in front of us here, as a bundle and as a solution, it's exclusively available to us. And we've got some wonderful vendors here who are helping us provide some fantastic solutions. We also have a team that can design. We have a team that can consult. We have a team that can then help you guys from a reseller's perspective and an end user perspective to try and get this right and make sure that we help you get the technology right, which will help the learning. And I think that's absolutely critical. So I'll finish with that. I'll thank you again for your attendance from the attendees perspective. Thank you to all of our panelists. And I think at that point, I'd just like to wish you a very good afternoon and say goodbye and thank you.